Well, welcome back, everyone. We'll get started shortly. Well, I think we can start. Welcome back. So we're nearly at the weekend. Happy Thursday. And congratulations. After today, we are over the halfway mark for the entire course. So again, I'll be posting midterm grades after just updating the MyLab grade, the average grade on all the assignments that are past the due date, getting caught up on quizzes. And then all I'm doing is taking the same grade that you see here as your total grade in Canvas, converting it over to a letter grade. Well, we have several things we're going to get through today. We're going to finish off Unit 5A most likely, get started on Unit 5B very next, talking about different problems that can arise in a statistical study. But any questions or comments at the moment? Okay. Well, probably also the bigger announcement also is that on Friday, after getting done with all the midterm grading, what I'm going to be doing next is immediately converting over to filling out the information here for our upcoming exam two. It's a little bit a ways away, but you know, these things somehow sometimes feel like they come faster than you'd expect. And so I like to just stay on top of these things, get prepared. When we come back on Monday, what I'm going to be doing on just Monday morning, just like with exam one, I'll email everyone instructions for scheduling the exam at the testing center that you selected. So really, we're just redoing the entire same process like we did on exam one. The very first thing I'll post is the coverage. And I believe for our exam two, let's take a look. Exam one ended on unit 3B. So we'll begin exam two material on unit 3C, running through chapter 4 on finance. But I feel like first, as far as statistics goes, we're not that far in statistics. And so far, units 5A, 5B are pure vocabulary. I'm thinking what I'm going to do for the coverage is just make unit 4D be the last section on exam two. That way we're not overloading it with too many just pure terminology terms. Chapter 5 will be getting on our exam, will be on our exam 3. Then next thing I'll post after putting those comments into words is the formula sheet. That'll be on the very back of exam 1. The exam rules, procedures, exactly the same as exam 1 was. And then finally the sample exam problems, versions 1 and 2, just like before. And also when we come back next week on Thursday, a week away from today, we'll do another review just like we did for exam 1. So that's the plan so far for the upcoming exam. And so that means for the moment, I'm going to think if chapter 5 is now being on exam 3, we're completely through exam 2 material, and we're just moving ahead to stay on with the schedule. Any questions at all, folks, with the exam announcement or otherwise? Okay, well, let's begin with where we left off on this unit 5A. You might have noticed for both chapters 4 and 5, the very first unit typically is really broad and lots of concepts to discuss. And when you start just talking about statistics, again, there's a lot of concepts and terminology and just definitions we have to internalize. So here's where we left off from Wednesday's class. We're talking about obtaining representative samples so we can do statistical inference appropriately and know that when we say something along the lines of a percentage like 52% really reflects the parameter, there's lots of things that can go wrong. But the very first thing we have to have go right before we do anything at all is make sure our sample really is representative of whatever the underlying population happens to be. So to get that representative sample, here are the several different sampling methods that are common. Some of them, unfortunately, common, as we'll see when we go through the list. Some of them, most of them are great sampling methods, but one of them in that list is a terrible one. First, we start off with a simple random sample. Simple random sampling is terrific. If you can make that sampling design happen, then the statistical procedures that you work through, the formulas are usually more direct than if you do something a little bit more complicated. And all a simple random sample has to do is we'll choose a sample in such a way that every sample of that size has an equal chance of being selected. And that's what we mean by simple random sample. Everyone essentially has the same opportunity of being included in that sample. Simple in the sense that we're not doing anything along the lines of breaking up the population into segments. Say if we're thinking about ISU as a population, we can break them up into segments or strata, say freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, graduate, and so on. We're just taking a random sample of the population as a whole, no other fancy thing going on. Well, that's a nice short definition, but it leaves a lot to be, excuse me, it leaves a lot to be desired. It's one thing to see the definition and a whole other thing to actually apply it. And so that's what this example is all about down below. It's an unnumbered example, so that means the purpose of this one is just for us to get a feel for what does a simple random sample really look like by actually taking one. So we'll demonstrate how to obtain a simple random sample of, say, 5 students, 5 of us, among a class, say this one, of size 22. That's how big our class is. So in doing that, there's lots of different things you could try. And if it's a sample of size 5, that means every possible sample of size 5 has to have an equal chance of occurring. And here's one way to make this happen. More often than not, we'd be using technology, and that's what the graphic here is kind of trying to convey. It says every sample has an equal chance of being selected, and it suggests using a computer, even though the image there looks like it's a random numbers from a list or a book or something. Here's what we'll do. We can use specialized statistical software, or Excel will do the job. And again, just to emphasize, if you have Excel on your machine right now and you want to pull it up, that'd be great. But this is just for the sake of a classroom demonstration. You're never going to be asked to do a problem on homework that requires Excel or any quiz, and certainly not in an exam. I don't know how that would work. We're just showing how are we going to do this if we want a simple random sample. First thing we have to do is we have to build the population. We're talking about all students in class, our class of size 22, and I won't list names, privacy is important, so we'll just use an identifier variable. I'll just put down numbers 1 through 22. If we were doing this, say, as an employee for ISU and we work for the registrar, we'd probably be using student numbers instead. So I'll call this the sampling frame, or you could call it population. So we list out all students. So here's student 1, student 2. This can take a while, so you can use equals, up arrow, and go plus. So there's your second student. And we want to go all the way down to row 23. So here's all 22 students. And next thing I want to do is, I don't want a formula because we're going to potentially mix some of these up. So what I want to do next is copy it, right click, and hit the 1, 2, 3 to just copy in the values. So now they're just ordinary numbers, no formula involved. And again, if you like Excel, you want to follow along, you're welcome to do so, but not required. This is, again, just us demonstrating what is a simple random sample actually look like if we go to take one right now here in class to demonstrate it. Well, any questions at all, folks, building out the sampling frame? Okay, after we have some kind of coding system that's going to correspond to every single student in the class, next thing we'll do is we're trying to take a selection of just 5 of these randomly. So we need to use a random number generator. Excel has a pretty good one built in, and true randomness is kind of a philosophical concept in a certain sense. So although we call these random numbers, what they really are called pseudo-random numbers. They are random enough that for the purpose of generating a simple random sample, they do a great job. But because Excel is just based off of lines of code, lots of lines of code, and it's a program that we execute, it's a deterministic way of getting these numbers. They just behave very randomly. It's hard to show exactly how I'm going to get the next random number when we list it in. So here I'm just going to call this random numbers for the next column. And what I'll write is equals, go RAND for a random number. If you go parentheses like these, you don't put anything inside there, you get a random number between 0 and 1. So there it is, one random number. And anything you do on an Excel sheet is going to change that random number. So if I type in 5, or I guess F, it turns out, hit enter, it's updated. If I delete that cell, it's updated again. If I just hit delete on that cell, it keeps on updating. And these are very, very random numbers. Sometimes they're above 5, sometimes they're below 5, sometimes really close to 0, sometimes really close to 1. That's sort of close to 1. So now what we want to do is put a random number to every single student on this list. So we copy this, paste it down. Now there's a random number assignment to everybody. And again, every time I do something here, it's going to update that random number assignment for everybody. But still, we haven't really said how we're going to pick 5 students. We have a listing of all students. We've assigned random numbers to all of them. But now this is going to give us a way to get 5 students out of this. If these numbers are completely random, and to a large degree they really are, then student 1 got a small number by random chance. Student 2 got a large number, and so did student 3, 4, just by chance alone. And you know what we could do then is sort these students by how large or how small all these random numbers happen to be. And that's a major idea. It doesn't matter how we sort them. We can sort them from smallest to largest, largest to smallest. If we do largest to smallest, we're taking the top 5 students, and vice versa if we sort from lowest to highest. Maybe take the smallest values, the lowest 5 students on the list. Well, that's the idea so far. Any questions or comments at the moment? Okay, so let's sort these numbers. Again, you probably don't want to do it manually, although you could in a size 22. And anything you do here, if I hit just delete even, it's updated these. So let's say that this is the random assignment. I'm not going to try to cherry pick it, so I'm going to say this is the official one. What you would do is then highlight all of these cells. Then I believe the function we want is inside data. Let's click that away. We're going to click on sort next. We want to sort the students. Let's go for the top 5 students. So sort by column sampling frame, the first column, and it's going to be sorted based on the values we see here. Or hang on. I want to sort by the random numbers. I think I'm getting mixed up on what I'm putting in here. Sort the cell values from, I'll go largest to smallest. Sorry, you should have picked this column right here to start it out. So here is the randomization. We'll hit OK. And now it's re-randomized them again. But what the old random numbers were, we had a definite sorting, and these were the top 5 students. So here's the 5. Well, I wish I kind of froze those numbers so there's a way for us to see what those numbers were before we sorted them. But you know, we could just do it again. Anytime we hit delete, we get a new random assignment. We can just resort these. Let me freeze these numbers. I'm going to just put them to the right. Now, these ones aren't going to move, but those just did, didn't they? Dang it, that's kind of hard to kind of freeze on paper once you do something like this. Here's my last try. Okay, I'm going to leave this to be the official sort. I'm going to sort to get the top 5 students once again. But Excel won't know if I take a screenshot, so it has no idea this happened. So now let's sort once more. These numbers are frozen, but once we sort, they're going to change again, but we happen to have a screenshot. We're going to sort on the random numbers, largest to smallest to get the top 5. Random numbers changed again, but here's what they were. Oh, but I didn't associate it to the original student, so that's a little bit tricky, but we do know that in row 1 was student 1. So my top student, it was student 17. This would have been 22, 21, 20, 19, 18, 17. That was the highest value in this list. So hang on, no, it was that one down there. I think I'm just getting myself a little bit mixed up on the process with the randomization.
Yeah, they
Sorry for
weren't
the,
in order when you screenshotted it. That's why you can't
yeah,
count
this was
backwards.
already sorted. Thank you for noticing that. Yeah, I think I'm just getting lost in the weeds on this. Thank you for that comment. It was starting to become kind of mysterious to me how we got those. Well, let's not get too far lost in the weeds like we just did and say that this is our random selection. These, oh, a little too far. These 5 students right here are the ones that would be included. Again, we reran the whole thing multiple times, but let's put down here on Excel. After sorting, the top 5 students, randomization changed again. Just as a little note there, because the numbers do look funny, they seem to not really convey what we were saying, top 5 students. The simple random sample consists of student 17, 2, 14, 21, and 8. So those 5 had the top 5 random numbers right before we randomized that one time. So that's a process. There's lots of different ways to do this. Statistical software can streamline this a little bit better, but if you ever have to do a random sample, maybe it's a project later on, this would be a great way to do it. Well, again, that was just our way to visualize what a simple random sample looks like. I think the textbook does a great job by just saying you're going to use a computer, so that's what they're trying to convey right here. You're going to use technology more likely than not to make this happen. Let's put this in as a screenshot on the notes just to show this is what we did for the simple random sample. I'll put it above so we can see that, but not get it mixed in with the definitions too much. So that's one of the more common sampling methods. It's a great method for getting a representative sample because what makes it representative is every sample the same size has an equal chance of being selected. So if we're, say, selecting 450 Idahoans across the state, we would probably have to use the state government or maybe the federal government to list out with census data every person that resides in the state. It's probably going to be something like more built up than Excel, but Excel would work for that. Then we just randomize, select 450 people, and that would be a simple random sample of 450 Idahoans. Well, that's one sampling method down. This one takes a little bit longer to think about. It's more abstract. The other ones are more visual, and our author had some pretty nice graphics to discuss them. But any questions or comments at all, folks, about that first sampling method? Okay, sometimes the simple random sample is not the method people select. Sometimes there's a good reason to do systematic sampling. And there's probably a lot of different ways that systematic sampling can come in to play, but typically this is how we define it. we use a simple system to choose the sample. And, that simple system could be really anything. But one simple system is selecting every 10th person or every 50th member of a population, or maybe more similarly, if we're talking about, say, a production facility, maybe it's making cell phones and thousands of cell phones are coming out, but you have to do quality assurance on that. Systematic sampling could be just select every 100th cell phone that comes off the conveyor belt and check that system. It is a kind of way to get a representative sample. It's questionable how random it is because there's a system on how we selected those things. But if selecting every nth member of a population, like on this visual, doesn't give us any kind of bias, say every third member isn't necessarily a person that resides in Boise and only Boise, that'd be a really terrible bias. If every third member, like this is showing here, gives us a representative sample, then systematic sampling might make sense. So it's kind of a weird sampling design. I don't think I've seen a lot of statistical problems that directly use it. It would probably be more in a quality assurance type of situation, like in a factory with products coming off a conveyor belt, is where this seems to be a more reasonable sampling design. So these are both bona fide statistical ways to get representative samples. A lot could go wrong here, but it's not like simple random sampling is perfect either. If every sample has an equal chance of being selected, and we're selecting 450 Idahoans, there is a chance you got 450 people in Rigby and only Rigby. It's just that that chance is extremely small with a simple random sample. It's extremely unlikely to have a bias, especially when the sample is a little bit larger at 450. And that's what makes this one a pretty good design. Then that takes us to convenience sampling. This is the first one, really the only one on the list that we have here, which is a bad sampling method. This does not result in a representative sample. If we use the sampling design, we get something else. We're going to introduce a bias. So this does not result in a representative sample. Well, maybe there is a chance that it could possibly by just sheer luck. But more often than not, convenience sampling is going to be taken as not representative. And what happens in a convenience sample is we choose a sample that's convenient to select, such as people who just happen to be in the same room. So for example, if I'm doing a study on all Idahoans, I've got 9 people other than myself in Zoom. I can make you be the sample right now, ask you whatever thing I want to study about all Idahoans, have you all respond, and I have a sample. It was convenient to select because you're here right now, and assuming you answer the survey question, whatever it happens to be, I have data now. But us people in Zoom right now certainly can't represent all Idahoans. Just because it's easy to take that sample doesn't mean we should. It's not going to be representative, more likely than not. And the textbook's little graphic here is kind of hilarious in a way. Just a person who is selecting people who are convenient to ask the survey question. This poor person is just walking a dog and it's being asked if they support the death penalty out of nowhere. So it's kind of humorous. And so is the method. If anyone tries to do a serious statistical study and it ever comes out that they did their sampling design in this way, they're going to be torn to pieces. The study is going to be invalid just immediately. And that could be tragic if the research question is a very serious one and we did everything right, but the sample was bad. It was tainted in this way. So that's a sampling design to be avoided. And the next two are bona fide sampling designs, where statistics do get a little bit more complicated, but sometimes they are necessary. But any questions with the sampling designs so far? Okay. The next definitions, in my opinion, are very tricky. It's sometimes not easy to tell apart when you first look at these definitions. What is the difference between a cluster sample and what is the difference between stratified sampling? So in a cluster sample, let's read through this carefully so we can spot the difference. We divide the population into groups, which we could call clusters, and then we select some of these clusters at random. So if we were, say, taking the entire state of Idaho, we want to sample Idahoans, we could say our clusters are every county in Idaho. We're not going to sample all the counties. We'll sample the counties randomly. So that's where the randomization happens with the cluster sampling. Then we do something different as well in the next stage. Once we know which counties we're going to sample from, we choose all members within each of the selected clusters. So that deserves some emphasis as well. So in a cluster sampling, if, say, for example, we selected some random counties and Bonneville County is one of them, everybody in Bonneville County, this is going to be a big effort now. That's a lot of people. Everyone in each one of the clusters must be selected now. So randomization happens on the clusters. We select everybody from within them. So that's what's going on with cluster sampling. And again, it's not a bad definition on its own, but it gets muddied when we compare it with stratified sampling. So here's the graphic that our author provided for cluster sampling once again. And let me zoom out just a touch. A little bit more, sorry for the far zoom out. We just want to show this graphic. In cluster sampling, we've selected, say, 3 different precincts inside a single county. Looks like the population itself must be Carson County, whichever state that happens to be. I'm not too sure. So if we want to have a representative sample of Carson County, they broke it up into these 32 precincts. Then they randomly selected 3 different precincts inside that county. This was more likely than not a simple random sample. So other sampling designs get involved in these as well. But once they have these 3 different precincts, they choose all members in those clusters, which are precincts here. So that's the kind of mental image we want to have when we're thinking cluster sampling. Randomly select the clusters, but once you've done that, everybody gets selected inside of those. Now, with that mental image, compare that against stratified sampling. So in stratified sampling, a really typical example again is think back on the population of all ISU students. If you're taking a sample of size 100 and you're using a simple random sample, it's a pretty good sampling design, but by sheer luck, you might take a simple random sample of size 100 and maybe just one graduate student at the level of PhD is inside of there. But really, if there's, say, 3% of the population of ISU students as a PhD student, you would have preferred to have 3 PhD students, not just the 1 or potentially 0 by chance alone. So you can insist you get those 3 if you use stratified sampling. What we do is we take a population like all ISU students and we define the strata to just be layers: freshman, sophomore, senior. I think I skipped junior for some reason. And then we look into master's degree, PhD degree. And then we select a simple random sample within each subgroup. So that's what's going on with stratified. Where if we're concerned about differences among subgroups, maybe it's male versus female, junior versus senior, and so on, then we separate the population into those subgroups, sometimes called strata for the stratified sampling. We identify the subgroups, draw simple random samples from within each subgroup, and that's what's different with the stratified sampling. The simple random sample happens inside the group, But in cluster sampling, the simple random sample happens on the clusters themselves. And here's a graphic for stratified. We're partitioning the population into at least two strata. This looks like this one's talking about male versus female. Draw a simple random sample. It says draw a sample, but we want to use a random sample, probably a simple random sample as our author indicated, from each strata, each subgroup amongst the population, like male versus female, or class level for thinking ISU students. So that's cluster versus stratified sampling. The highlighting is trying to convey the difference between the two, but I stole this graphic right out of our textbook because I think it does a great job as well. Well, any questions at all, folks, with those sampling designs so far?
I just kind of make sure I understand. So what you're saying is like, say if we needed a sample size of ISU students and we're taking them from each of the colleges. For the clusters, we would take all the colleges and then randomly pick like 4 colleges to pull all of the students that are in that program. But the stratified sampling, we would take all of the colleges and then randomly pull like 5 students from each college. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly the nature of it. So in the last one, stratified sampling, like you said, we have to say what all the colleges are, then take a random sample from every single college, and then just put them together, like you said. And then cluster sample, we list out all the colleges, randomly select, say, 2 or 3, let's just say 3, but everybody in those college has to now be put into the sample, choose all members.
And
So
these
yeah,
are
that's
both
different.
good, these are both good ways to do sampling.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And it just depends on the context on why you'd use one versus another. It depends on what you're doing. If you're, say, someone doing something in geology, if you're studying a certain kind of rock, you might be thinking more along the lines of a cluster sample. You would take a geographical region, probably make a really fine grid, and then look at all the, I'm not great at geology, let's just say, look at all the, what's that word? Look at all the lava rocks, I'll just say, that you can possibly find on the surface of these small little areas, these plots in the grid. So that kind of study would make real good sense for a cluster sample. But if you're thinking stratified sampling, the ISU colleges is a really great example. If we want a sample of the size 100 of ISU students, we want to make sure that there's no bias whatsoever against the colleges. Maybe that's part of the study, comparing the colleges themselves against each other. Then we want to make sure we take a random sample of a certain size from each particular college when we do that. So again, they're both good methods. They can become bad methods if they're used inappropriately, but in the right context, it could be the best thing to do, depending on the study itself. Well, other questions so far? Thanks for those comments at the moment. Okay, again, in a typical statistical textbook, this is what you get: a listing of definitions. Our book is not so bad. I've read plenty of statistical textbooks that don't have really good visuals, in particular for cluster versus stratified. So these are really nice mental images to have when you're thinking about all these definitions. But the next thing you have to really do to really fit these together to see what these really look like is you have to have more examples. So here are more examples. These are all just kind of made up studies, but we're going to imagine that these studies were real and just answer the question of what sample was this? So peek above on the notes to double check on the list of all possible samples. It says identify the sampling method amongst these that we were just discussing in the definitions in each of the following studies. So let's give this a try. These were mixed up, they were randomized using tricks just like here in Excel. So they're, for a problem like this, almost guaranteed to be out of order. Now part A says, researchers are studying the soil quality of community gardens. So that's their goal. They want to know how good is the soil? Maybe in terms of pH, in terms of nitrogen, other kinds of nutrients. What they did then to study the soil quality of community gardens, they selected simple random samples of 30 plots in urban environments, 30 plots in suburban environments, and 30 plots in rural environments. So their sample size is 90 total. But what would you all say that feels like as a sampling design? Which one does this fit in the best? Oh, sorry, I missed the chat. Yeah, I agree with Amy. This one turns out to be a stratified sample. Notice what they've done. They have taken some area that's been divided up into different kinds of regions or strata. They're looking in urban environments, suburban environments, and rural environments. Really, that just kind of describes all areas, say in Idaho Falls or Pocatello. You can divide them into three kind of environments like that. That starts to look like stratifying, much like in this image, male versus female, or in the ISU example, it could be freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, graduate, or the various different colleges. We divide up the population into strata. Here, the strata was urban, suburban, and rural. But there's another critical thing. You have to take random samples from each one of those strata. That's what this is saying. Identify the subgroups, or you could call them strata, draw simple random samples from within each one of them, and you're looking into stratified sampling. So part A fits this picture and that definition, stratified sampling. And for these kind of problems, you don't have to give a full explanation, just the output here is just fine. If you gave the explanation, it wouldn't hurt. You're convincing yourself as well. So that's a great strategy. But really, you'd just be restating the definition. The explanation is we took the population of all plots for community gardens, then we broke them up into subgroups or strata, urban, suburban, rural, and then we took a simple random sample from every strata that we identified, every single subgroup. So again, that's pretty much just the definition of a stratified sample just in itself by explaining it. So it would be tedious to write out that definition each time. It's okay to just give that as a full response. This one is stratified. Well, let's compare that against part B. A local restaurant is testing a new biscuit and gravy recipe at the entrance to Albertsons. That sounds exciting. I would want to be part of that study. Hopefully, if it's a delicious new recipe, they sound confident. But what would you all say this fits in? Between these 5 different sampling designs, which one is this? Yeah, I agree with Amy. This one's a convenience sample. The restaurant is excited to test this out, but what they did was they just went to Albertsons for no apparent reason, and they got everyone's opinion there. Now, is this going to fail? Are they going to go out of business and everyone hates their biscuit recipe? Was this not representative? You know, if it's something about taste, we might not be in too much trouble here. If it was instead something about a very divisive opinion, that might have been a really bad idea. But even still, this is not the greatest sampling design. They could have tried a little bit harder because you might argue that this was done on one particular day. It could have been done, say, around 3 o'clock on a Monday, where a lot of people are working. And now we're looking into the opinions of people who are maybe retired or people who are possibly not working. And it starts to skew the opinions on this, whether people really like this. We're not really looking into a representative sample whatsoever. We're just taking a convenient sample, and yeah, the restaurant could potentially get in trouble over that. Trouble in the sense that people don't actually like it. Even if everyone at the entrance to Albertsons, I mean, they're excited they got free food probably, and they're just trying to be nice. This is going to be a terrible kind of study. But for answering the question, all we have to say is that this is a convenient sample. This restaurant is possibly right next to the entrance of Albertsons. That's why they did it. They didn't have to drive too far, and they just got the data to what was immediately available to them. Even though it might have been better if this restaurant wanted to do a different kind of strategy here is think of their population as being the people who actually go to the restaurant, and then just over the course of maybe a couple of weeks, randomly select patrons on different days, different times of day, starting to look like a more complicated sampling design. But if they did that instead of just random people at the entrance to Albertsons, they're focusing on the population they care about, people who actually go to their restaurant, and they'll have to try to get a representative sample of their actual patrons at the same time. So they could fix it. They should just not do that. Stay away from Albertsons, focus on their real population. So that's 2 down. And here's our next scenario, part C. An ecologist assigns a unique identification number to every registered national park in the country. And there's probably an easy way to do that. I'm sure you could get Google going for you to find out all the registered parks and then assign that number to it. Or maybe work with the federal government. They possibly will be happy to help. So after they assigned a number to every registered national park, it says the ecologist uses a random number generator to select 12 parks for a detailed wildlife survey. Well, amongst the 5, and elimination is not a bad strategy to think about. Those 2 are out. This is how a good MyLab problem is probably going to look. There's just 3 down on paper. Doesn't sound like a cluster, right? Even though you could think of each national park as a cluster, it didn't say they studied every single animal in every one of those clusters that they randomly selected. That would make it a cluster sampling. So this one's definitely out. Between the 2 here, what does it feel like? A systematic sample, or does it feel like a simple random sample? Yeah, I agree with both Amy and Zach. This one is absolutely a simple random sample. The telltale sign about that is they built a sampling frame right here. When it said every registered national park was given an identification number, that wasn't too different from what we did right here. We gave an identification number to every student in the class. So this is building a sampling frame. I'm not going to come back with the definitions of sampling frame, but just for the wider context of how you do a simple random sample, that's part of the terminology. But then they went beyond that. They used a random number generator. It could have been Excel or purpose-built statistical software to select a sample of size 12. So that has all the features of what a simple random sample would be, what it would look like. So this one is the simple random sample. So that's 3 down so far. And again, thinking in terms of elimination, the last ones become easier unless we made a mistake. So we still want to make really sure that whatever this study is, it really fits into the last ones remaining. So we are done with simple random sample, convenience, and stratified. And this one's saying every 100th cast iron pipe that comes off an assembly line is tested for its durability. I think everyone would agree that sounds like a system, I think. Would you all agree with that statement there? It's much like selecting every third member in a population once you have a listing of them. Selecting every 100th cast iron pipe that comes off assembly line would be just the typical kind of sampling design in a factory type setting like this one. So we're at a Systemax sample for that response there. Systematic sample. But you know, the tricky thing about the definition of a Systemax sample is it could be any kind of system and it could be convoluted, but we're not going to go too crazy for problems on an exam. You'll know it's a telltale Systemax sample if it's basically something like this. Every third person, like in the image, every 100th cast iron pipe. That's the giveaway. It's a Systemax sample. I'm not going to invent new weird sampling, Systematic type samplings, just for the sake of a different confusing exam question. So usually this one's a pretty easy giveaway just by those keywords there. But any questions with the ones we've gone through so far? Okay, well, it takes us to part E. And again, we're doing this by elimination, so you probably have a good idea of what it should be. But let's make extra sure it really fits the definition. We found the simple random sample, the systematic, the convenience sample, and a stratified sample. So we think it's a cluster sample. But again, imagine if this was a real exam. If we got any one of those others wrong, then we could make a mistake if we don't think about this one as well. So this is like checking our work at this point. Making sure part D really fits the cluster sample. So let's see what they did. A forestry scientist is studying a new fungal disease affecting pine trees in a massive national forest. So we're only interested in one forest, say maybe the Yellowstone National Forest. And we're worried about a fungus infection on pine trees. And so to study this, here's what the person did. The forest itself is naturally divided into 150 distinct geographical tracts. It's a massive national forest, so this looks like it's going to take a lot of manpower. We probably don't want to go into every one of those 150 geographical tracts. So instead of studying all of them, the scientist randomly selects 5 of these tracts and examines every single pine tree specimen to study the fungus within those 5 tracts for the fungal disease. Well, that does have all the markings of a cluster sample. It's much like selecting precincts out of a county, except this time it's a national forest, and we said geographical tracts instead of saying precincts. So what has to happen is they have to randomly select, and we see those words, randomly selected, 5 tracts out of all of them, the 150, much like the 3 precincts being randomly selected here. Again, it had to say randomly select for it to be a cluster sample. We can't just choose the geographical tracts that are easy to get into. So if one of them involves sheer cliffs, then sorry, it's part of the sample. The foresters are going to have to go out there and look at those trees, even if they're going to be rappelling off a cliff. But once they select those tracts, again, the next thing is they have to study all members of the selected clusters. In this case, they're pine trees. So let's double check. Examines every single pine tree located within those five selected clusters. So that has all of the right markings. This is what makes it a cluster sample. So we can say with confidence, if we did this as an exam question, it really is a cluster sample. Again, this would be an exam 3 question, just for a reminder. But you know, that's pretty tricky. These are 5 technical definitions. The visual absolutely does help. But when you do these in MyLab, if you're having any trouble with what MyLab says the right answer is, any trouble on getting through those, don't hesitate to ask about them. In class, during office hours, through email, I'll be happy to help out. But any last thoughts, folks, on getting through all 5 of these sampling designs? just fixing some penmanship here. Okay, well, we're nearly done with these notes. And again, when I wrote the syllabus schedule, I didn't have a great idea of how long these notes will take, but it takes a while to talk about all these elements of statistics, so not stuff you would ever want to try to rush through. This is time well spent. So here are the last concepts. There are, once we decide to do a statistical study, there's really two kind of categories. We've mostly been talking about observational studies, probably exclusively throughout these notes. We've been discussing what an observational study would be. In fact, the last one, the National Forest with the 5 different tracks selected, that's an observational study as well. But there's also an experiment, or sometimes called experimental design. And this one has an incredibly important role in statistics as well. So let's take a look at both of these. In an observational study, again, essentially all the studies we've been looking at so far, what happens is researchers observe or measure characteristics of the sample members, but do not attempt to influence or modify these characteristics whatsoever. They're just observers. They're seeing what's happening. Thinking of the forestry example, they select a cluster sample, they look at the pine trees that has the fungal infection, but they're not going to spray the tree with some kind of anti-fungus spray or anything whatsoever. They're just studying what's out there right now, not trying to affect anything whatsoever. So again, that's the observational study. These are two technical definitions, just like before, that are not always easy to tell apart. So let's really focus on what makes a study suddenly become an experiment. Well, it's an observational study. We're not trying to influence or modify the characteristics of what we're studying in the first place. And an experiment is just the opposite. Researchers apply treatment to some or all of the sample members and then observe the effects of the treatment. Well, that's some interesting wording. I typed it up verbatim from the textbook. When we say we apply a treatment to some or all of the sample members, keep in mind a bona fide experimental design has to have a control group or it's going to be invalidated right away. But here's the opposite end. In an observational study, we don't influence anything, we just observe what's out there. But in an experiment, we apply a treatment to all or some of the sample members. So we're trying to influence something intentionally. Say, for example, if we're studying, say, a new blood pressure medication, then what we're going to do is gather maybe 40 people all together. We're going to divide up those 40 people into 2 different kinds of groups. One group is going to get the legitimate new blood pressure medication. The other group is probably going to get a pill that looks, feels, probably smells, if it has a smell, exactly like the real blood pressure medication, except it's an inactive ingredient. Nothing's going to happen when they take that one. Then when they apply the treatment, they're going to see what happens after the course of maybe 8 weeks. What's their blood pressure? In the treatment group, after 8 weeks have gone by, has it increased or decreased? We're hoping a decrease. But we're only going to say the blood pressure medication was effective if it outperforms people given the treatment in the control group. They're likely given a placebo where they can't even tell if it's the real thing or not. And the medication has to beat what's going on in the control group. If the control group also lost some blood pressure being treated with the placebo medication, that can happen because just the outcome of being treated with something gives you the placebo effect. It gives you less anxiety. Your blood pressure is probably going down just because you were given a pill by a doctor. This medication will be effective if the treatment group outperforms the control group. So in the control group, sample members do not receive a treatment. They're the baseline. They're the ones we compare against. And the treatment group, they receive the treatment being tested. So again, I feel like the wording here is really kind of weird. This is our author's verbatim wording for an experiment. So let's add just an additional statement here for clarity. A bona fide experiment must have a control group. So if we gave everybody the new blood pressure medication and there's a drop on blood pressure, we can't actually conclude that that drop was caused by the medication until we compare it against the control group and see if it really outperforms. So this is the essence of an experimental design. We take our participants, we divide them randomly to receive either a treatment, and there could be multiple treatments, or to be in a control. We can't allow people to decide where they're going to be. So the people being put in the control group and the treatment group are selected randomly by the researcher themselves. Well, any questions at all, folks, with the experiment versus the observational study? Okay, well, armed with this knowledge, here are the last two questions on the notes. Both examples 6 and 7, it's the same question. We have a real study we're looking into. We just want to know, is this an observational study or is it an experimental design or just experiment for short? Here, for these kind of problems, we would be asked to justify our reasoning on these. So first thing to do, and this is kind of par for the course in statistics, sometimes the context is a lot of reading. There's lots going on here. We have to absorb this, see what's really going on, and then we can make an assessment. Was it just an observational or was it an experiment? So here's how it goes. It says in the article, baby scientists experiment with everything in a 2015 publication. It describes a series of studies published in the Journal of Science. So, okay, this title was just as it was reported in the Wall Street Journal, but this is a very serious scientific journal. So people did some interesting work on this. It says on one of these studies, 11-month-old children were assigned one or two groups. You know, that starts to sound like an experiment, but that's not good enough. We have to keep reading to see if it really was an experimental design. So let's keep reading through this. The children in one group were shown a ball behaving as expected, such as rolling into a wall, falling off a ledge. So kind of physics as normal. Well, in an observational study, we're just observing. We're not trying to change anything about the behavior of the children. And here, this was just a ball behaving as normal. If they did this to all the children, then it doesn't sound like an experiment. But here's what they did to the children in the other group. The children in the other group were shown a ball behaving in an unexpected way, such as rolling through what appeared to be a solid wall. Maybe they had a magician on staff, or rolling off a ledge and remaining suspended in air. So something that breaks physics. And it's starting to really look like an experimental design at that point. There's two groups, and group one, this looks like a control group. Nothing different is happening. The babies are just observing grown-ups playing with the ball, so that's kind of weird already, but the ball's behaving as normal. This looks like a control. But then they're trying to affect the behavior of the children by doing something different. They make the ball do weird things, like something a magician would do, being suspended in the air, going through walls. This sounds like hang on, my color coding is backwards. Let me fix that really quick before we get mixed up in our head. This one looks like the control group, which we use green. Let's stick with green on that. Sorry for that jarring color coding. Here, we did something different to the children. or messing with their heads, using a magician to make that ball do things that shouldn't happen in ordinary physics. That sounds like a treatment. Well, here's what happened next in the study. The children were then given a ball and another toy. The researchers found that the children in the group that saw the ball behaving as expected, so physics as normal, showed no preference for the ball over the toy. So they probably went for the ball half the time that they went for the toy. But the children who saw the ball behaving in an unexpected way, when they were given a ball and another toy, they didn't care about the toy. They're extremely interested in the ball. They played with it differently, tested the behavior by dropping it or rolling it, trying to reproduce the unexpected results. They caused a change in the baby's behavior now after doing these two different kinds of treatments. So this has all of the hallmarks of experimental design. And it kind of makes sense of what the title is all about. If you show an 11-month-old baby something weird, they're now interested in, they want to investigate this. So here we can say, this is an experiment. We need to justify this explanation. We're going to do that by just looking into what makes an experiment. But first, let's think in terms of, it wasn't observational because this part, in an observational study, we do not attempt to influence or modify the baby's behavior, is what we mean by characteristics. But here we absolutely did. We tried hard to modify the baby's behavior to cause a change in what they were going to do. So we can say this is an experiment, either by framing in terms of the observational study, like we said, or you could just say, because the researchers split the babies into a treatment group that was where the ball was behaving weirdly, and a control group to see if it caused an effect in their behavior. And this is another reason why experimental design has a really special role when it comes to statistics. You can make an inclusion that says cause and effect whenever you do a real experimental design. But for an observational study, you can never make that conclusion. You can just see what you observed, but there's no treatments to discuss cause and effect like there is for a real experimental design. So on pretty much every study that we've been discussing and all these notes until this one, where the experiment showed up, no conclusion of cause and effect could be made whatsoever. We're just observing what's happening in the data. Well, any questions at all, folks, on identifying this experimental design here? Okay, well, if this one's the experimental design, we're thinking probably the next one is the observational study, but let's make sure that really is the case. Let's pull these definitions down. And here's our next example to take a look into. It has a pretty inflammatory sounding title. How dangerous is a day in the hospital? In my opinion, it can be very, very dangerous. Lots can go wrong. And this looks like it was a real study in 2011. It describes a study to determine the risk of an infection. Many kinds of horrible infections, say C. diff among one of them. They want to know if the risk of infection is related to the length of a hospital stay. And that's some really specific language. They're not going to say the risk of infection is caused or is increased by longer lengths of hospital stay, that sounds like cause and effect. So they're just saying is related to. That's some very specifically chosen language. And here's what they did. The researchers looked at many hospital patients, compared the proportions of those who got an infection for two different groups of patients. Now, hang on, when you say two different types of groups, that might sound like a treatment group versus a control group. So we have to be patient with these kind of problems. It's not easy to tell right away, is it an experiment or is it observational? Well, what were the groups? That's going to resolve it for us. There was a group who was hospitalized overnight. And there was a group that were hospitalized for more than one night, potentially many weeks that could have been included in that group. So why can't that be an experimental design? Well, imagine you're looking into hospitalized patients. There is no way you can say, I'm going to take 30 of you and randomly assign you to stay one night. And I don't care if you had a heart attack or any kind of coronary event. I'm going to take the other ones of you and make you stay for more than one night. And I don't care if you just came in because you had a broken finger. You're staying in for 2 weeks. That's an impossible experiment, right? It would never pass any kind of ethics board. It just seems cruel and unusual to dictate how long someone's going to stay in a hospital just randomly. And experimental design, you randomly select who goes into what treatment. So, by that logic, would you all agree this has got to be an observational study? Okay, let's put this down on paper. We'll say this one is observational. And again, just because you found two groups does not mean it's automatically an experiment. We'll say observational because the patients were not randomly assigned to different lengths of stay at the hospital. We just observed the data. We weren't trying to influence how long you stay at the hospital. We measured characteristics, what percent got an infection of any kind, it sounds like. But we didn't say how long you have to stay at the hospital. That would have made an experiment, but again, that sounds cruel and unusual, something that should never happen with human subjects or animal subjects even. And so that's what's making it observational. The patients were not randomly assigned to different lengths of stay is really the major portion. If they were randomly assigned to be in a control group or a treatment group, it would have been an experiment. Well, that would qualify for a great explanation for why it's observational. And again, you could say other things about this. There's different ways to explain it. Any different take that you say that corresponds with the definitions would be considered correct. So if you had a different explanation in the back of your mind, it probably works as well if it fits the definitions. Well, any last questions or comments, folks? Getting through that last example 7. Okay, one fast takeaway, again, still thinking in terms of experiments versus observational studies. This observational study, even if they found higher percentages, they said the word proportion, where's that word? There it is. If there's higher percentages, or you could say proportions instead, of people getting infection for longer stays, they still cannot say those higher proportions were caused by the length of stay. They have to say is related to. That's a wishy-washy way of saying it, but what they're trying to specifically avoid is observational studies cannot give a cause and effect conclusion. So actually, them saying is related to right here was kind of a giveaway when we think about it. This one really was observational, even before reading the last points right here. They never even attempted a cause and relationship conclusion in this study. Well, we got through it, folks. Unit 5A was a lot longer than I thought it would turn out, but with statistics, there's just so much to say before you even get started. When we come back next Monday, we're going to be looking into other ways the sample can be biased. Then we'll turn into actually doing some descriptive statistics, doing some computations slowly. So the entire chapter isn't going to be just pure context and vocabulary the whole way through. We'll eventually start computing things. But any last questions at all, folks, before we call it a night? Okay, well, have a great weekend, everyone. Next Monday, we'll be in the next unit. Take care.